in Asia and around the world, and of course, US nefarious influence everywhere. And these particular views of trade have been around for a very, very long time, and they are re-emerging again at the moment, as I'm sure we're all aware. The important thing to recognize is that what they are all trying to say, these views, in one way or another, is that they don't like trade the way it's happening because it's being seen as monopoly. One particular country is monopolizing trade with another to the disadvantage of the country on the receiving end of it. So we say snakes and ladders. The populists, or those who are rejecting free trade, both in the past and at the present, are saying, no, it's monopoly. And in fact, in some countries, historically, this was the norm, and today you're hearing the same thing again. People are saying we'd be better off playing solitaire, basically just trading internally as much as we can, and really just trading at the margin with other countries, rather than looking to free trade as the answer to everything. And let me stick with history a little bit further. Growing up in the UK in the 70s, I can actually remember seeing pictures like this in my textbooks at school to try and explain why some countries were rich and others were poor. Does anyone remember this vaguely? No? Yes, no? Basically, that countries started off trying to guard their national treasure. They would try and export more than they imported to run that lovely trade surplus, build up their treasure balance. And they would do that by the mother country, or the powerful country, exporting high value-added products to weaker countries in what we used to call the third world, who would sell them raw materials back, generally at low prices. This is still actually banging around as a theory in some political circles today. We will come back to it later. Now, I want to look at a long run again of historical development of free trade here, because the actual idea of free trade was first developed around 1817 by David Ricardo, for those who have read their economic history. And it only really kicked in the UK in 1846, about 30 years later, after the corn laws were repealed, of course, so the UK could import corn from Europe and focus on specializing in industrialization, because we were the first country to industrialize. Now, initially, if you see there from the picture, in 1846, everyone says, great, let's play snakes and ladders. The UK specializes in industry, Europe specializes in growing food to feed the UK. And that lasted quite a few decades. Everyone copied it across Europe and said, this is a really, really powerful economic theory. We're all getting better off. The problem is, if you look, after 1873, we started to have a global or a European depression, largely because we had oversupply. Agricultural products were flooding out of the US, depressing prices in Europe. And a lot of Europeans were looking around at the UK, which was dominating the global economy and dominating the global politics, and basically said, how comes we haven't got a strong industrial base like them, and we're only growing food to feed them? And they actually started to argue this was a trick in encouraging them to specialize in growing low value-added food rather than high value-added industrial products. And one by one, European countries started to move back to playing monopoly, trying to protect trade, trying to develop industry behind tariff barriers, and then finding other countries to grow food to sell to them. This is historical fact, even if it's a bit uncomfortable and not generally brought up in economics textbooks. Now, the problem is, if you have everybody trying to play monopoly at the same time, it doesn't work. You actually play a different game, and that game is Risk. And for those who haven't played Risk, basically it's a board game where you try and conquer the world. And lo and behold, those political pressures, as they built up, are exactly what led us incrementally towards World War I. And free trade, of course, completely disappeared into World War I. It then came back again in between, collapsed again World War II. Now, at the moment, we're all shocked, horrified by the protectionism that's re-emerging in the US under Donald Trump. Obviously, it's pretty outrageous, some of the things he's saying. If we're looking at history again, the interesting thing is the US was firmly protectionist, and I mean really firmly protectionist, all the way until after World War II. Here I've got a list of different US presidents. I don't know if you can see them, hopefully you can. But here's some fantastic quotes that they've all come up with over the years. I'm just going to run through them all. I'm not going to read them out. But just take your time and absorb them. My personal highlights are Abraham Lincoln, give us a protective tariff and we'll be the greatest nation on earth. Or, thank God, I'm not a free trader. Very Trumpian, all of them. So you can see, actually, the US was very, very much in the camp that I'm describing here now of trying to protect trade, trying to export as much as possible and import as little as possible to become the world-dominating economy that it is today. It's exactly the same technique, of course, that many Asian countries have used, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, that only changed after World War II when there were no competitors, when there was only really the US, and at that point, everything changed and we entered the world that we understand today, but that I would argue is actually starting to come to an end. Now, the world was different after World War II, economically and politically, because we shifted to a world in which the US dollar was key. The commodities that you all sell are priced in US dollars. Global trade is carried out in US dollars. Internationally, everyone thinks primarily in US dollars. Now, how did we get to that stage? We got to that stage because everyone could get US dollars by selling to the US. If you wanted to get dollars, it was easy. You just sold something to the US, which was now open for the first time. Trade was no longer a zero-sum game, as it used to be in the past when we had to try and get gold off of other people or silver. You could get dollars very, very easily. Very important point. The problem is, Donald Trump is now showing us that the US appears to be moving back to the pre-World War II pattern of thinking about trade. Now, Trump's only one man, but I put it to you, unpopular as he may be in many circles, is there really a constituency in the US that in an election coming up soon could say, let's go back to completely free trade? Let's ignore everything that Trump's just said. Clearly, it's wonderful if we keep importing more and more and more from other people and don't export to them. I would argue no. I don't see that's a realistic political position within the US at the moment. And if we look at the size of the US trade deficit on the left there, and the two countries that are primarily driving it, which is China in blue and Mexico in orange, you can see why Trump is bashing those two countries in particular. Because there's nothing wrong with a trade deficit if you're importing capital goods. If you're an emerging market importing capital goods to invest because you're short of them, that's basically like investing in your own education for the future. It's going to pay off. If you're importing consumer goods, every dollar you spend is a dollar you could be spending at home. Now, it may sound controversial, but in certain circumstances, Trump is correct, or his advisors are correct. Trade deficits can reduce employment, and they can reduce income. And even if he's saying it in a very angry, inarticulate way, there is some logic to what Trump is saying. And I don't think politically it's going to be very easy for people to push back against that. So really, when will we see this big shift towards protectionism in the US? Because it hasn't happened yet. We've only had rhetoric. I don't think it's an if. Let's look at what the guys around Trump and Trump himself are saying. We've had Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, saying there's trade, there's sensible trade, and there's dumb trade. And we're going to stop doing dumb trade. I would say they think dumb trade is that, frankly, they just keep buying and don't sell very much. And Trump himself is a businessman. Let's not forget that. And businessmen think, very logically, if you buy more than you sell, you go bankrupt. No business can operate on that basis. Clearly, he thinks the US should operate like a business. It should be selling more than it buys. Or at least its trade should be balanced. And of course, his advisors say the same thing. His policy advisor, Steve Bannon, has openly called himself an economic nationalist. Openly, in several interviews. Peter Navarro, who's guiding Trump on trade, has written a book called Death by China. If you Google it, you can watch it as a movie on YouTube. It's actually surprisingly good viewing. And his US trade representative nominee, Lichthizer, wrote a very, very comprehensive paper back in 2010 that argues the US should unilaterally derogate China's WTO membership because it cheats on the WTO terms so much. Unilaterally, they should just say, China, we don't consider you're in the WTO. So these are the guys around him, and yet we still have people saying Trump doesn't mean it. I find that very unlikely. Trump's also saying, I want to leverage the vast US market to do bilateral trade deals. Yep, we'll buy from you if you buy from us in equal amounts. That is exactly what China does. So we're going to see a shift where the US starts doing China-style trade. And that does represent an absolute leap forward or backwards, depending on how you look at it, in our entire global paradigm. Because here's the risk board beautifully laid out for us. And if the US does step back like those arrows just did, everything starts to change for all of us globally over time. For example, here you can see the TPP. Now, I made myself particularly unpopular. I'm usually unpopular, but I was particularly unpopular when I came down to see clients around 18 months ago, and I said the TPP will die. I don't understand why everyone's getting so excited about it, and that dog will not hunt. The US is going to kill it. They came up with it. There's no political wind behind it. It's going to die. Well, it has. It has crawled off, unfortunately. So it's exited stage left. And what we're all talking about now, in Australia very much so, from what I read in the press, is a new China-centric Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, which always makes me think about Aretha Franklin. Here you can see all the blue countries clustered together. Now, it looks wonderful, doesn't it? It does look wonderful. They really cluster very nicely. The problem is, let me tell you now, it's not going to work. Not going to work at all. Because when you look at a regional grouping, you're presuming that it can start to work the way the EU does, where you have a lot of intra-regional trade, and extra-regional trade is at the margin. Well, have a look at the trade balances of all the countries in the RCEP. And again, I want to sing some Aretha Franklin every time I say that. You've got surpluses and deficits. Can you see who's running the enormous surplus there in blue? Any guesses who that is? It's not Australia. It's China. Everybody else is running small surpluses or small deficits. There is nobody in that grouping who is running a deficit big enough to absorb everything China sells. Nobody. It will not balance out as a group. It may trade more between themselves a little bit, but you are still going to be looking at other people to be buying the end product. And the US is saying, not us, mate. And Europe is looking more and more like it's going to say, not us, mate, either. So really, that worries me a lot. It's not going to balance out. Who's going to absorb that huge surplus from China? Now, China's actually got bigger appetite than that. It's talking about the One Belt, One Road, or the new Silk Road project. And here are all the countries that China is talking about building infrastructure to or through to link itself to the rest of the world. Now, that works. In fact, if you're playing Risk, I don't know if anyone ever did in their youth, if you play Risk and you get all those countries, you've won. Fantastic. That's a really great grouping of countries. And if you look at what everyone produces or has and offers within that grouping, that can really work. You've got high technology, you've got cheap labor, you've got consumers, you've got a fantastic military in there as well, quite frankly. It really is a very, very powerful grouping that could mean America can exit stage left and just go and trade pretty much with Canada and nobody else. Fine, you're on your own, no worries. Unfortunately, that's not going to work either. You can see why I'm unpopular. The reason is, what currency are they going to use to trade together? We live in a dollar-denominated economy. I hope I've made that clear already. What you can see here on this chart, this Technicolor chart, is the share of global banking transactions, that's SWIFT transactions, interbank, done in different currencies. Now, the orange ones are in the dollar, and the blue ones are in the euro. Now, the blue ones we can pretty much take out, the dark blue. They're not going to apply to most of that One Belt, One Road. They're just within the Eurozone itself. So look at the orange compared to everything else for the rest of the world. And in particular, look at the little red slice at the top. That's the renminbi. It's irrelevant. Absolutely irrelevant. We hear lots about China trying to internationalize its currency when it's actually reversing at the moment. Over the last 12 months, that offshore holdings of renminbi have dropped significantly after all the interference that China's made in the financial markets. So how are you going to trade within that block if there are fewer and fewer US dollars available? Because this is the key point I'm getting across. If the US doesn't run a big trade deficit, where do the dollars come from? How do you get dollars? How does country A have the